All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. It's my honor to be here with you. My name is Wendy Venverlo. I'm the Executive Director of NAPSA. I'm really excited about the session that we have for you today. Before we get started, though, just a couple of brief kind of announcements or updates from me. Since you're here today, I think you probably already know about our webinar series, but in case not, or in case you haven't seen, we have a couple of more webinars that are scheduled. They are available on our website, and I'm going to put that link in the chat. I just put that in there right now. So there's sessions for April and May available on our website that you can register for. So check those out at that link. Also, something related to our session today, if you did not know, we have a brand new blog. We just started it a few weeks ago, in large part due to Hillary's leadership. Hillary, who's on the call here and part of the faculty today. We have about 4 blog posts. There are more coming, but I will just kind of draw special attention to the most recent blog post, which is written by guest author Glenn Tapia, who's here as our presenter today. I put that link in the chat as well. You can find our blog there on our website. And that, like I said, the blog post that's most recently gone up is related to today's session and kind of our ongoing series of sessions that we're having with Glenn. One more thing, and that is also somewhat related to Glenn, or I'll continue in that vein, I guess. We have our conference coming up, and we will be opening registration in the first half of April. So please be on the lookout for that. That will be opening everything for registration for participants, as well as the vendors and sponsors who would like to come, as well as registering for scholarships and also award nominees. So all of that should be coming out in the first half of April. So if you want to keep an eye on our website, also on our social media channels, as well as our emails that we send out, we will have information updated there soon. I'm going to throw that link also for our website into the chat, and so at least you have some of our most recent stuff. And one thing I mentioned that we have the session with Glenn today. We have the blog post that Glenn was a guest author on, and then also Glenn will be joining us for a full day session at our conference on Sunday. That's kind of a new thing. We did something like that for the first time last year, so I'm really excited for Glenn and Hillary to be joining us and doing that session for us on Sunday. We will have more information once registration opens about that, but you will also be able to see Glenn during our regular conference as well. So this is sort of like a preview and sort of like step one, or a taste to get an idea of what more is to come with the conference. I think that's all I have as far as announcements. And just again to say thank you so much for being here. And I will turn things over to my colleague, Glenn Tapia.
Thanks, Wendy. And Hillary, feel free to say hi. We're here to talk to you about culture is king today. We're going to talk a little bit about a lot of things today related to culture to kind of set the stage for thinking about culture and the work that we do. I'm Glenn from ACJI, and this is my 30th year working in the justice system. 37 of my years has been spent mostly in community supervision, but also some institutional work in jails and correctional facilities throughout the career. It's all I've done. Hey, Hillary, say hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hillary Hartoin. I'm the Court Services Director in Cass County, Indiana, and I'm also the NAPSA Director at Large. I've worked in the pretrial field for my whole career, and I'm excited to bring you a little bit more about leadership and how that work and culture can really transform your pretrial work today.
So for our webinar today, we're going to talk a little bit about, Hillary's going to talk about the pretrial context of culture. I'll be doing some kind of basic things. We'll talk about how and why culture rules and why we say culture is king and why we say culture is upstream from things. We'll talk about like what is culture. We'll talk about control versus commitment culture. And then we'll start getting into some elements of organizational culture, both mindset elements and environmental elements. And then we'll talk about well-being. We'll talk a little bit of leadership modeling. And then we'll talk about culture and implementation and some of the issues that work with implementing programs and practices. And then we have a call for action for you at the end. So keep your fingers ready on your keyboards. We're going to do a couple polls today. We're going to do some chat interactions. And of course, we always have the Q&A to be able to ask questions, and we'll handle those at the end of the webinar today. So we've got lots of stuff for you today. Hillary, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We always say that culture is upstream from strategy, culture is king, and you certainly have some lived experience with that. So what are you thinking about that?
I really kind of want to get you guys to think about is pretrial is very much not able to operate successfully in a silo. And we have many different cultures that we interact with. We have our agency culture, our staff, how we interact when we actually supervise clients. And then we have the broader system culture that we interact with, because pretrial sits really at a nexus in the system between public safety and supervision. And we interact with balancing due process with public safety and stakeholder decision making. So to really be successful, we have to have a culture that's going to drive and sustain pretrial reform. And that really kind of that nexus of where we operate is kind of illustrated here at the next slide, because you'll see that we kind of have all these different areas that pretrial is aligned throughout the justice system with our stakeholders. We balance community trust with the rights of the clients and public safety, as well as the view of our stakeholders in court, not just our judicial officers, but our public defenders and our prosecutors. And oftentimes cultures upstream, because when we're not aligned in that, we're not going to make good decisions, and our pretrial reform and our efforts to have a good operating pretrial system will stagnate if we're not aligned all together and have that culture to sustain us in a very dynamic field. When we talk more about pretrial culture, like I said, we're not operating in isolation. Oftentimes in other areas of community supervision, we can exist and get away with more easily operating in that silo. Pretrial release can't do that because we are dependent on everyone kind of flying in unison and working together as much as possible. And as much as we can, we have to have a system that is aligned, because we are at the center of some very high topic priorities in our field. And it often can be high tension and pretrial, and that can affect the climate of your culture and how you show up as a leader and how you relate with your staff and your stakeholders. And that tension that we have, whether it's from reform or the different narratives going on in our world today, that's exactly why culture is important, is how we navigate that. Because, you know, culture is the anchor to the tide that we have in pretrial release. So I guess what we'll talk about is, I would challenge you to think about, when you think about the culture in your pretrial system, where do you most feel pressure? Where do you feel that from? Do you feel like your culture is reinforcing the purpose or the goals of pretrial, the 3 M's that we talk about? Or sometimes it's a culture, whether it's internally or with your stakeholders, working against that. And it's often those friction points, those areas where we're misaligned, where, you know, that's where our culture needs attention and we need work to move forward.
So we invite you to use the chat if you want to answer some of the questions in the chat. Always curious to hear your thoughts. So we're going to talk very broadly about culture, then we'll get into some specifics without getting kind of too deep. You can see a kind of usual academic version of what we call culture. I'm not going to read this to you. You can kind of read it to yourselves. But a lot of people go to the academic world to understand organizational culture. And a lot of times what the academic interpretations usually involve are some version of what you see on the screen. Number one, it's a pattern. So it's things that happen over and over again. You know, culture is basically what happens when things happen over and over again. Usually the academic definitions have some concept of shared basic assumptions. Hillary and I are going to push back on that a little bit today, because it's not that simple in the pretrial world, where sometimes we have different basic assumptions and competing basic assumptions. And Hillary did a good job talking about how when we talk about culture as one thing, it's really many things. Oftentimes these academic descriptions also talk about it's learned over time. So it's kind of what people learn through different exercises and decision making and how we solve problems. It's validated through success, which means that a lot of things are reinforced over time. And when we have good experiences, or what experiences sometimes make us feel good, that just reinforces some of our mindset habits and those kinds of things. And it's also taught to new members. Oftentimes we welcome people to the new job. We give them their ID, we give them their keys to their office and say, go and do good things. But then they really get assimilated into the organization by the informal rules. And a lot of culture is from those informal rules. So the thing that makes it challenging with pretrial is the second bullet there, those shared basic assumptions. Oftentimes we're working in divergent basic assumptions, even something as foundational as retribution versus rehabilitation, constitutional protections versus victim rights. Those kinds of things can put us in conflict, and as Hillary mentioned, put us in tension situations. And that tension is a really good way to kind of think about culture as always living in tension. One of the things, the way I like to think about it is you take all the concrete stuff in your organization, rules, policies, procedures, forms, data systems, all the really technical components, the tactical components, the things that you can put on paper and change on paper, those really technical, concrete things. You take those, you add it to the abstract or the adaptive things. Those are the more ambiguous things: values, beliefs, assumptions, traumas, incidents, rituals, norms, all the really informal things. You put those two things together, the concrete, the abstract, and you raise it to the exponential power of dialogue and interaction, which basically means that we can't just change culture by changing the concrete stuff. You can't just put out a new sign or a new mission statement, which is a concrete technical thing, and say, this is our new culture, everybody abide by it. Culture is much more complicated than that. So if we want to change culture, we have to change the way we talk about certain things. And that's the dialogue and interaction, the power of dialogue and interaction. So we're going to be talking less about the concrete today. We're going to be talking a lot about the abstract things as well, because those are the things that some people really struggle with in learning to change culture, assess culture, adapt to culture, some of those types of things. The other
Yeah,
thing that we can, go ahead, Hillary, go ahead.
I would just add in pretrial, the concrete things are our risk assessments, our policies, and our tools. But we all know those are only as effective in our systems in regards to who's being released and over conditioning. A lot of those hard tension points that we get to, those are only as good and as effective with the beliefs and the values of the system actors who actually act out those rules and those policies and the different trainings that we have. And that's where the nexus is with the culture and why it's so important to think about the abstract and go beyond the policy and the infrastructure.
Yeah, right, that's an interesting thought. Like, for example, if a risk assessment says the person's medium risk or moderate risk, it could be culture that really determines what to do with that, not so much the instrument itself. Is that where you're going with that?
Sometimes, absolutely, that can be what we see in the pretrial world.
So, which wins, the risk assessment or the interpretation of that risk assessment? I think we would make the argument that the interpretation of that risk assessment is just as powerful, maybe not, maybe even more powerful than the risk assessment outcome itself. So, that's a really good example of how those abstract things and the way that we understand and the assumptions we make from the concrete things really drive culture. So this is just another way to illustrate the same point. If you view, culture as like an iceberg, at the tip of the iceberg, you see all those concrete things, the behavior and habits, the practices, the policies, the rules, the processes, all those really technical things. But below the surface, the driver are those abstract things that are invisible sometimes. I mean, that's the subconscious level. And then our kind of cultural roots, where we came from as systems. A lot of our organizations carry a lot of informal rules and stories and ghosts from the past, and those things can really inform how our culture is today, even though they're things that have made it happened years ago or decades ago or many generations ago. So I often think of culture as like the tip of the iceberg is how things are done, and the bottom of the iceberg is why things are done. And so we're really going to be getting into the why things are done, because sometimes I think we focus so much on how things are done without really getting into why things are done. Hillary, anything to add to that?
Just say sometimes it's those historical beliefs and those myths, those different narratives that we that go on with pretrial that can really those are kind of what's going on beneath the surface and can affect our practices. Underneath the surface, maybe those beliefs that more control equals more public safety, more conditions equals a safer community. And until we change those values and attitudes underneath the surface, we're not going to be able to have lasting change in pretrial For many of us, we know on the surface level that when we over-condition people, we're actually going to have more instances of misconduct in the community. But there's those underlying narratives that until we work through them together as a team, we're not going to see lasting change in how we act out our work.
So, Hillary, that time that we got on the cover of the newspaper, the time that we got sued, we lost, the time that a defendant who was on electronic monitoring and did something bad, those go into our traumas and incidents, our myths and our stories, our rituals and traditions. Is that the point you're making?
Yes.
And we what if about those situations a lot. We what if to the worst case scenario. And so oftentimes we resist the new thing because we're what ifing about the worst case scenario of things that happened to us in the past. So that's just a really good illustration of some of those ghosts and stories and rituals and traditions that really, really impact how our culture is today. Fair to say that, Hillary?
Absolutely.
So if we break culture down from an assessment standpoint, this is the way that we assess culture at ACGI. We'll go through this fairly quickly, and then we'll get into some of this content. There's a kind of a basic tool that we start with, which is called the Organizational Culture Assessment Inventory. It's essentially a basic structural tool that just kind of lets you know of 4 different archetypes where your culture lands the most. We all have different aspects of these 4 archetypes in our culture. We won't get into the details of that, but it's basically just an assessment that says you're more like this archetype than that archetype. So then we get into the areas beyond that, which is like mindset stuff. And we have 3 areas that we look at: adaptive, appreciative, and infinite mindset. We're going to talk a little bit about that today and talk about mindset as a lever for change. But mindset isn't the only thing. It's also our environment. It's also the kind of external forces around us as well, not just our internal mindsets, but also our environment itself. Sometimes I think of culture like soil, and soil is the environment that plants live in. We have to work on the soil, not just the plants, so to speak. So some of those environmental factors are our feelings of psychological safety, organizational safety and trauma. Collective well-being is kind of like the degree to which the organization takes care of its people and vice versa. And then leadership climate control is just a fancy word for our own self-awareness and our emotional intelligence. It's essentially the degree to which as leaders we are vulnerable and humble and those kinds of things because we have a really outsized impact on culture. So what we're going to do today and the rest of the time that we have is go through some of these elements a little bit, give you a little bit of information about them, to make the case that number 1, culture is a lot of things, and number 2, culture can be changed and culture can be what we want it to be if we put the work in to be able to do that. So we're going to start with a real basic frame of culture, and we're going to call this compliance culture. We're going to kind of make the case that there are 2 types of culture. There are actually more, but we're just going to make the case for illustration purposes of compliance culture versus commitment culture. Let's say we were to name culture, give culture 2 different names. One is compliance culture, and that is kind of this concept that I believe in that the enemy of great is not being bad. The enemy of great is being good. And the reason I say that is if the journey from bad to good were a mile long, then the journey from good to great is like 5 miles long and uphill. It's harder work to become great. And commitment culture is different than control culture because the way I see it, control culture or compliance culture is really about when people feel like we have to do the minimum requirements in order to avoid a punishment. So I kind of think of it as like compliance or control culture, which is like do all these things, kind of do the right thing, so to speak. But if you don't, there's a consequence or there's a risk or there's a problem if we don't. And so that perceived consequence can be perceived or it can be real. And so the problem with the compliance culture, it really gets people to really do the minimum rather than use to go into I consider their discretionary effort, which is getting beyond the good to get to the great. Compliance culture can be challenging for people because it's usually full of rules, hierarchy, implied punishments, implied consequences, and just kind of this implicit message of do the minimum to avoid a consequence. So like you would know it when you see it, if you see a lot of hierarchy, a lot of control measures, fixed and strong structures in place where we do things the same way all the time. Usually very little autonomy is given to people. People are just kind of there to meet the policy, meet the procedures, meet the rules. And then when people ask questions, they're usually answered with a process question. Rather than a purpose question, they're answered with a process question. So in these types of cultures, power dynamics are really strong. It feels like change is imposed from the top down. Not everybody has an equal voice. And when you hear the language, it's often about avoiding risks, following rules, worst case scenarios, some of those things that we just got done talking about. And those perceived consequences can actually be feel stronger than the actual consequences. It might feel like I'm really going to get in trouble if I speak my mind, or I'm really going to get in trouble if I make one little mistake, or I have to be perfection, otherwise I'm going to lose my job. We have these like outsized understandings or assumptions of what the consequences are when the real consequences may not really be that much. We might get sued, we might, suffer a catastrophe or things like that. Hillary, I think you might have some thoughts on this as well.
I think here sometimes, especially in pre-trials, that we get so focused on the worst case scenarios that we frame our entire agency around that, and it shapes how our decisions are made. And sometimes that has the adverse effect of what we think is going to happen. And it really shows up too in our stakeholder meetings. Pretrial really is driven, effective pretrial, in my opinion, by a high functioning stakeholder team where we all come together. That doesn't mean we all have the same voice or the same opinions, but we need to make sure everyone has a voice. And in compliance culture, we all know those stakeholders teams where the dynamics are strong when one voice is stronger than the other. And that can really affect how we show up. And we can become so risk averse that we forget about the impact on the people that we serve and really the essence of what pretrial is all about.
So in a few minutes, we're going to ask you to give us your opinion on whether you're a little bit of a compliance culture or a lot of compliance culture, or maybe you might be part of commitment culture, which we'll talk about in just a second. This is just a graphic to let you illustrate what compliance culture might look like as opposed to commitment culture from kind of ground level pretrial agency services. So, for example, if you're working with defendants, for example, it would look like a lot of rule focused conditions, a surveillance mindset, responses that are really driven by sanctions, where you're always looking at deficits and risks and kind of punitive measures to help the clients get basically from bad to good, to do the good thing. So you're really looking for, did the person follow the rules? That's really the elements of compliance culture. But in commitment culture is going beyond the minimum to avoid a punishment and getting to this higher purpose. And getting to this higher purpose is that stretch of that 5 mile stretch from good to great. So in that realm, then you're like saying it's not good enough just to avoid risks, but who do you want to be? Where do you want to be in a couple of years? What's the story you want to tell about yourself in a couple of years? And being more grounded on kind of letting the person complete their term with better off than when they started, so to speak. And that really is the difference of a person first and strength based system that's also looking at like strengths and growth and opportunities and those kind of things that help people not just get from bad to good, but good to great. Hillary, I don't know if you have anything you want to add
Yeah,
to
so if
this.
you think about it, the compliance culture is really that over conditioning of supervision, or we're stacking on conditions, we're not tying it to risk. We're acting out of fear or out of a risk-based mindset, and we're focusing on the deficits. And whereas the commitment culture is really where we've seen, and last month's webinar, and you hear us talk about all the time, is supportive services with the least restrictive conditions. So moving away from over conditioning people to bringing in supports to help them overcome barriers and be successful on pretrial supervision. And oftentimes when we do that and we focus more on helping people be successful, we're less likely to over condition them, and we have more success in the end in pretrial.
So maybe if Brian Levins were here, for example, Brian Levins might say that compliance culture is more like a referee, where you're calling the penalties and enforcing the rules. Whereas a commitment culture is more like a coach, where you're invested in the outcome, you're trying to get people to do their best work, and you're not so much focused on calling the penalties, you're focused on getting people to win the game. Is that fair to say that, Hillary?
Yes, absolutely.
So the commitment culture then is really a commitment to a future vision. And as Hillary had implied in what she had said, if we don't have a future vision of ourselves, of our agencies, of our cultures, of our organizations, we're relegated to the past. Again, if you don't have a future vision, you're stuck in the past. And because of those worst case scenario things, the things that we've lost lawsuits on, when people got hurt, the people that made us look bad, only the negative things of the past are the stickiest things for us. That's called a negative positive asymmetry. It's just a matter of the human brain that we're stuck on those negative experiences and traumas and incidents and those kinds of things. So commitment culture is really more of a focus on a future vision of ourselves that is focused on innovation and reform, one that we invite healthy risks, where we're inviting of some of those healthier risks, where people have a real voice, where we apply that free discretionary effort beyond just doing the minimum to avoid a consequence. And our guidepost and our North Star is really an ideal state of being, not maybe not the place we are today, but the kind of aspirational place we want to be in the future. So that requires an infinite mindset, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. It implies a growth mindset, which is like always learning and growing. It also requires leaders to be vulnerable and humble. So we're going to be talking about that today. And in that environment, leaders are really self aware. They ask for feedback, they're humble, they're vulnerable, and psychological safety is really strong, really growing. It's just an overall difference of commitment to a higher purpose rather than compliance to the minimum necessary. Hillary, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's really illustrated well with with the next slide here, that when we have a shared purpose and mission, and for pretrial, we think of the three M's. You can really drive it back to that: maximize release, maximize court appearance, and maximize public safety. We can't effectively do that unless we have a culture where we feel safe enough for each other, where we can talk through those tension-based issues with pretrial because of the historical things that happened in the past. And we're not going to have long-term change and an excellent pretrial system. There are a lot of good pretrial systems, but we're going to be great and take it to the next level. You have to be able to come together with a trust for each other and not just focus on short-term solutions or act out of fear or be always reacting to the latest narrative or the thing that was published in the newspaper or the latest trend. We need to stay focused on our goal.
So the way I think about it in the difference of these two types of cultures, and we'll go in more into this a little bit, is like compliance culture is basically a focus on the thing that you're fighting against. And when you focus on the thing that you're fighting against, you're literally hyper focused on the thing that you don't want. And that's really draining. Like when you spend all of your day solving problems, focusing on risks, focusing on problems, you go home to your significant other, and the dreaded question is, how was your day at work? Right? That's because we spend all of our time in what we call the depreciative state. It depreciates you from where you want to be. It's the problem focused state. It is the state of cooperation where I'm just going to do the minimum to cooperate with what other people want to do. And that is really energy draining, and you go home really fatigued. Whereas the commitment culture is more energy positive, where you're focusing on where you want to be, and that struggle is the focus where you're literally hyper focusing on the thing that you do want. That's when we can get to a place of co-elevation where we're challenging each other, supporting each other, making each other better and smarter. We're still in conflict with each other, but we're in conflict reaching for the thing that we want rather than trying to avoid the thing that we don't want. It's all the difference in fighting for something that you want versus fighting against something. When you fight against something, your heart's at war. When you fight for something, your heart is at peace. And when people's heart are at peace in an organization, they're working towards that kind of higher purpose. So, Hillary, you've had some thoughts about kind of concurrent cultures, which is a way to kind of talk about the complexity of pretrial cultures. Maybe you
Yeah,
can
so
kind of help folks understand that.
yeah, like I said before, I think pretrial services in our field is really different in that as a leader, especially, we're kind of always the bridge between two cultures. You have your internal agency culture, your staff. That's your mission and vision that we talked about, evidence-based practices, the value of your staff. Are you creating a learning environment, operating with a client-centered approach? Least restrictive conditions, people-centered supportive services, but you're also tugged on the other side by your stakeholder and your system culture. Do you have shared beliefs about what risk and safety is? Do you value the data, the performance measures, what the evidence and research says about pretrial versus some of those misconceptions that we see? Are you collaborative and working together and communicating? Are you open to innovation? Then you layer in the media and the political climate of today that sometimes puts pressure on us, and also all those historical practices. And I often feel like sometimes as a pretrial executive that I'm kind of constantly pulled between those two cultures. And at the center of it, I'm really trying to prioritize public safety and the expectations of my court as well as my other stakeholders. And sometimes that can lead to a lot of pressure in the organization that I can then push over onto my staff unintentionally. And that's what emotional contagion is all about.
So we are going to launch a poll, and we're going to ask you all to register on the poll what kind of a culture you think you are. Your options are going to be heavy control. So, do you feel like you are in a control culture that's in a really heavy environment? Like, in other words, do you feel like you're very much a control culture? Option two is you're a little bit of control culture. Option three is a little bit of commitment culture, that focus on the higher purpose and that kind of future vision of yourself. And then option four is a heavy commitment culture. So, I would just invite you to respond on the poll. We will when we get to about 85% response, we'll stop the poll, we'll show you the results, and we'll see if this aligns with our assumptions or not. So it looks like we're getting a pretty good response rate here, getting about 62%. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop the poll. We'll show you the results. And as you can see, a lot of us are kind of in the middle. You can imagine a bell curve between a higher proportion towards control, although um, somewhat of an even split overall between the two. But you can see sometimes we're in tension between that control and that commitment culture. And I think Hillary's intuition that we're in those points of tension between that control and that hierarchy versus where we want to be ideally. I think this kind of tells me that we're in tension. Hillary, is that kind of how you see those things?
Yeah, I think it's often like we're walking a tightrope with pretrial. You know, as leaders, we're very passionate about the work, but yet we operate in control heavy environments. And that doesn't mean that our stakeholders are micromanagers or things like that. They're very passionate about public safety and safety in the community. And we're all balancing those pressures together. As a culture. So I want to emphasize that the tension that you feel isn't always a bad thing or means that you have, you know, a negative environment within your culture. It's just a lot of different heavy topics that you're working together as you're trying to advance pretrial services in your environment.
So the point we want to make today is that, is to work on your culture, not just in it. Sometimes when we work in our culture, we become its victim. When we work on the culture, we can actually help reconcile those tensions that we're trying to be at. So if you want to be in a commitment culture, you got to work on it. If you want to work on being more control, you got to work on it. You got to put effort into it. So when we don't work on culture, it usually just kind of evolves to where it's by accident or what we call by default. And usually cultures will erode or get more complicated in those situations. So we want to really take on the mindset of working on the culture and not just inside of it. Much like a farmer or a gardener works on their soil. They don't just work on the plants, they work on the soil, which is the environment around it. So we're going to give you some thoughts about how to do that and then give you some initial thoughts and talk about mindset as a lever for culture change. Remember that equation that we presented, concrete stuff plus abstract raised to the power of dialogue and interaction. Mindset is one of our really strongest levers for culture change. Rules and policies are okay for culture change, but you can't change mindsets with rules and policies. Those are technical, concrete things that don't change the abstract. And so if we really want to change the abstract, the mindset, we got to work on mindset. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Essentially, the reason we believe that mindset is a lever for change because it shapes culture. It's been well known through the research that our assumptions, our values, our beliefs, like we said, even our basic core beliefs about what's the right thing to do in a tense situation, that really, really drives culture. And so some of those kind of taken for granted assumptions, some of those thought habits that we form, if we want culture to change, we got to challenge those kind of thought habits. And the things that are most contagious in this realm of mindset is the leadership mindset. It's been very well researched that how leaders believe and how they operate because of the power dynamics and years of experience that we have as former leaders and things like that, that has a really, really powerful contagious effect on how other people think. New people to an organization will learn to think like the leaders do because in large part they respect the leaders or they fear the leaders. And so leaders have a really outsized version of what we call the emotional contagion, which is what's contagious around a water cooler. Also, psychological safety is a really contagious aspect, which is really this concept of the degree to which we feel speaking up and being ourselves. That's a really contagious thing. And like we said, just what people generally believe to be true and why they sign up for the work and things like that. So, Hillary, did you have any thoughts about this as well?
Yeah, and I think in pretrial, this is especially true when we're coming all together as a team, and whether it's like advancing our target population or implementing a new risk assessment. For example, in pretrial, mindset set really shows up sometimes in how we interpret those assessments and risks. Two of your stakeholders can look at the same case, and one can see just outright danger, where one can see manageable risk. And that isn't always a difference in policy, that's a difference in culture and how we show up together. And, we can have a lot of it isn't just the leaders and that. Think of the different loud voices that show up on our stakeholder team. And then when we have, the nature of our work, we have new leaders kind of cycle in and out, and you have new voices that you have to kind of reshape your team and your culture to work together as your agency evolves and over time.
So, we're going to talk about three different kinds of mindsets. We'll go through this fairly quickly just to give you the kind of type of mindset that we're talking about and its opposite, if you will. So, one thing that forms culture is adaptive mindset. An adaptive mindset is essentially the way I like to think about adaptive mindset is it's a agile mindset. It's about flexibility. It's about innovation. It's about adjusting to complex conditions. It's basically takes challenges as like teachers. The adaptive mindset is a mindset that is like um, we have a lot of uncertainties, we have a lot of ambiguities in our work, and we're going to solve those with experimental solutions. So the adaptive mindset is a very curious mindset. It's a mindset that is understands and welcomes the complex and the adaptive, so to speak. It kind of works against the things that are really black and white. That would be more of a technical mindset. It really embraces the gray in the 50 shades of gray in between the polar opposites of black and white, so to speak. So if the adaptive mindset has a motto, it would be like, we expect to change, we expect to adjust as we learn, we stay flexible, we experiment, we try new things, we ultimately prove based on what's happening around us. And it's kind of just this overall flexible, agile type of a mindset. One way you can think about that is to think about its opposite, which is a technical culture, which is all about directives, applying existing expertise. It's about that compliance thing that we've been talking about. It also reduces problems to simple fixes. So it'll take a complex problem like a staff mindset or lack of buy-in to a risk assessment or lack of adherence to a certain thing, and it'll kind of relegate that to a really quick fix. I'll say, well, people don't want to do this thing, we'll just make them do it with a rule or a policy or a procedure or something like that. Doesn't usually address the underlying mindset problem. So the technical cultures are, again, really rule bound, compliance driven, kind of punitive towards mistakes. They don't welcome a lot of mistakes. And it's really a short term focused culture. Whereas the adaptive culture is kind of a long term focus. And again, it's more learning oriented, it's more psychologically safe. It's more about kind of diverse opinions and things like that. So if we want our culture to change, we can choose either a technical culture or an adaptive culture. An adaptive culture is more experimental, more innovative, more change oriented. Another way we can look at difference in culture is the appreciative mindset. And here, appreciative does not mean like, I appreciate you, you're a good person kind of appreciate. That's not what it means. It means things you want to grow in value. It's the opposite of depreciative. So if you think about like your money in the bank, you want to appreciate and value, and you don't want it to depreciate your assets to depreciate. So appreciative culture is basically focusing on the strengths. It's focusing on the ideal state. It's not focused on the risks and the problems and the worst case scenarios. It's actually kind of really studying the things that you want to fight for rather than the things you want to fight against. So if the appreciative mindset had a motto, it would look like we focus on what's working, we build from our strengths, we look for the strengths, we scan for the strengths, we learn from our successes. Failure is our teacher again, and we're just kind of continually growing towards the ideal state of where we want to be, and our eyes are on the future state and not so much the things that keep us from being good. The depreciative state is really that problem focus, is what we talked about, that energy draining kind of focus where you're just focusing on orders, control, overlooking staff efforts, scanning for problems, scanning for errors, scanning for risks, calling out risks. It's that referee kind of mindset that we had mentioned that Brian Levins might say. It's very compliance driven. It's blame oriented. There's a lot of pseudo-silence, which we'll talk about in a minute, where people just kind of zip their lip and don't say what needs to be said. And it's really short-term fixed. It's really affixed on the short term. So that would be a depreciative culture, whereas an appreciative culture is obviously the opposite, is reaching for that future state, reaching for the ideal state, and looking for the things that are teaching us to grow rather than looking for the things that are causing us problems. Hillary, anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think that's really true in the pretrial world. Sometimes, by the essence of pretrial, we're kind of stuck in the depreciative mindset because we're constantly mitigating risk and anticipating what could go wrong. That we kind of can carry that over into how we lead our organization and how we let it evolve, let alone how we interact with our clients every day.
Yeah, and risk needs responsibility kind of lulls us to think like this, right? Because we look for risks, the thing that stop them from being low recidivism or low, appearance or whatever. Needs, which are the things that are keeping them away from the ideal state, and then responsivity factors, the things that are in the way of addressing risks and needs. So it kind of coaches us to like focus on those negative things. And so, really, if you believe in like desistance theory and some of those other things, focusing on the ideal state and the strengths and the kind of human focus is more in the appreciative side of this paradigm. Then there's the infinite mindset. This is the opposite of this is the finite or fixed mindset. There are some differences there that we won't go into today. But the infinite mindset, if it had a motto, is we're here for the long game. We're playing the long game. Our job is not to terminate change, but to perpetuate change. We're always learning and growing. We're reaching for this. We're in this for the long game. It's really abandoning the short-term wins and really reaching for the long haul. It's kind of this long-term permanent commitment to perpetuate change rather than terminate change. So if it were a finite mindset, it'd be focused on the endpoint. It'd be focused on the end of the change process, looking for short-term metrics. When you look at like people that are rivals, they are enemies to be beaten rather than people who could teach us how to do things differently. And so the infinite mindset looks at rivals or people who work in different parts of the system for us as like, hey, I might be a prosecutor, but I can learn from the courts, or I might be a court, but I can learn from the defense attorney, or I'm the defense, I can learn from the prosecutor, or I'm the prosecutor, I can learn from the pretrial agency or whatever. That's all the difference between an infinite mindset versus a finite mindset is how you perceive people that are different than you. So the finite mindset is also focused on control, compliance, rules, all those kinds of things. Whereas the infinite mindset is kind of saying the rules guide us to the boundaries, but we're really focusing on the long game to really be a better organization 10 years from now and even beyond. So the point is there's different mindsets that influence culture, and we can choose different mindsets. In order for us to choose different mindsets, we have to work on different mindsets. So Hillary, what are your thoughts from the pretrials perspective on that?
Talk about pretrial, I think of four different areas, and Glenn kind of will dig into these more from the broader viewpoint. But when you think of control heavy norms, that is kind of the mindset with pretrial from a lot of our stakeholders that more rules, more monitoring, more oversight equals better public safety. And we all know that that's not what the research says. It comes from a good place with our stakeholders. Again, I want to emphasize that, but it often leads us to over supervise. And then again, what we talked about, we have that deficit based problem solving. We're trained to look for what goes wrong. Even our performance measures highlight the percentage of times that things don't go wrong versus being more strength based and looking at other areas of success, like the reunification of families and people being able to be employed when they're on pretrial and contributing members of the community. And for me, one of the most dangerous things is the pseudo-silence and the groupthink. And that's where we stop questioning our practices. And even though we know they may not be working, we're not speaking up at those stakeholder meetings and advocating for best practices for pretrial. And that's often where we stall too, even if we're a good system and we are doing best practices, then we're not going to innovate because we just kind of get lulled into that sense of pseudo-silence and groupthink. And then we talked about compliance without commitment. And sometimes that's where we need, if we want better outcomes, we have to move beyond the check boxes and really start building that buy-in and that culture to support that long-term change.
So I think about myself, Hillary, sometimes with this compliance without commitment. Like I think about myself going to the gym. If I'm in a compliance mindset, I'm going to go to the gym to check the box, do the minimum to kind of get through the workout, right? But if I'm a commitment focused when I get to the gym, I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to push myself. I'm going to challenge myself. I'm going to focus on the long game. I'm going to focus on the ideal state of myself. I'm going to go beyond my discretionary effort. I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. I'm going to challenge myself. I'm not going to go do the minimum. I'm going to really try to reach towards the best version of me. Is that kind of how you see it too, Hillary?
Yeah, and I see that not only with our clients, we want our clients to do this, but we need to model it as leaders when we work together with our system actors and our players as well. It's not just enough to be, as Brian would say, a coach with your clients. You need to be that with your team as well, and always being thinking ahead to what success looks like for a pretrial on an individual level, but then at a system level as well.
Yep. All the difference in the world is the mindset.
So for me, this graphic here really kind of spun out of a data dump or a brainstorming session I had with Glenn. And for me, it's the web of culture with pretrial. And often you'll see that when we pull on one corner of the web, it creates tension or unravels another area. You have the pressure of public safety. You have those high profile cases, the expectations of our funders, or the political aspect, where we're risk adverse. Then you have the push for client-centered practices and supportive supervision, equity, and oftentimes, and then you have the expectation of your stakeholders, and then you're managing the expectation of your staff. And when we have that control heavy norms and those risk avoidant decisions, oftentimes when that is our climate of our bigger system, that is then going to transfer onto us, and it's going to weaken innovation, and it's going to weaken our ability to stay true to our passion, to that commitment over compliance. And then that in turn is going to be transferred onto our internal agency and our staff. And it kind of creates a loop where it weakens everything together. With that, because the emotional contagion is when we inadvertently transfer those negative things onto other people. And oftentimes, as leaders, that external pressure from our other culture gets transferred internally to our staff and then has a negative impact on the people that we serve. So it's very much a tangled web that we navigate as pretrial leaders.
You know, Hillary, I'm a child of the 80s. You wouldn't know it by looking at my bald head, but I am a child of the 80s. And so I've always thought of the justice system as like a Rubik's Cube. And I think this graphic helps display that too, of like every color represents one of these goals that you have on here. And when you solve the white, you disrupt the blue. When you solve the blue, you disrupt the white. You solve the red, it disrupts the green. My experience in the justice system is constantly navigating that Rubik's Cube and trying to solve the problem of the day while disrupting something else. And I think the way you've illustrated this kind of makes that same case is that you solve one problem, you create two more. Fair to say that?
Yeah, and it isn't always problems. It's just, quieting the concerns and the voices of different
Hmm.
people and navigating that landscape and trying to maintain that balance, that culture. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. But that's why the wellness of you as a leader is so important, because it's very much a tense place to be in. And there's good tension and there's bad tension, but we feel it the same. Um, and I'm a firm believer in that, and that can really impact how we show up every day with our staff and with our stakeholders.
So let's talk about some of those pieces because mindset is part of it. It's also not all of it. And so one thing that we really want to be focused on is leadership vulnerability. One of the most powerful things of getting to a commitment culture or more innovative or change-oriented culture is the degree to which leaders feel vulnerable and humble. So there's a lot of great research about this. And it's the idea of like leaders being able to show openness, admitting their limits, and valuing other ideas, that we don't have all the answers sometimes, and that our lived experiences might be wrong. You know, we might be seeing things as cynical rather than wise. There's a fine line between cynicism and wisdom. And so the idea is that, we want other people to contribute to this ideal state of where we want to be. There's two really key factors of why that is in the research. Number one is that in people that are in innovative kind of commitment-based cultures, They feel like the reason that they want to contribute is because they feel like it's their job. They feel like it's not somebody else's job to make this organization great. And they think like it's meaningful work. So they believe that part of the reason I signed up is for us to reach this kind of ideal, audacious state of where we want to be. So one of the things we really want to be mindful of, if we want to change culture, it really starts with us. And one of the things we'd like you to take away from the webinar today is that as leaders, you are culture. Whether you're a formal leader or an informal leader, it doesn't matter about your power or where you're at in the hierarchy, but you really are culture in the way that you show up, much like Hillary has made the case today. So we can have vulnerable people even in hierarchical control cultures. That creates, as Hillary was saying at the beginning of the webinar, some subcultures and teams that have really good engagement, really good innovation, really good kind of change orientation, some of those kinds of things. So we want to really take the mindset it starts with you and then it starts immediately around you. And if everybody did that, if everybody took on that mindset that it starts with me and it starts with the people immediately around me, we would have better cultures and we would have a lot of people working on culture rather than just a few of us, if that makes sense. So bottom line, if you want innovation, you got to start, you got to live it. You got to be that person as an informal leader. Again, taking that leadership of looking in the mirror and taking the mindset of I am culture. If I want culture to change, I got to change me. I got to change the way I show up, much like Hillary has made the case today a couple times. So we would like your opinions. We're going to do another poll here. We would like your opinions on which of these mindsets works for you. We're going to do this one here. We're going to ask you of yourself, thinking of yourself, what daily leadership behavior of yours should most often shape our culture? So we're asking you basically, do you feel like you should show up with an adaptive mindset, which is flexible and agile, or an appreciative mindset, focused on the ideal state in the future, not the past, not the problems and the risks, or an infinite mindset, which is playing the long game, playing the permanent game, not trying to perpetuate change, not terminate change, or if you think that the control mindset or the control culture is better for you as a leader. So we just want to challenge our assumptions by collecting these poll data, basically asking if you were to lead change from your perspective, where would you lead from? Would you lead towards from an adaptive mindset? Again, flexible, appreciative mindset, focused on the ideal state, not the problem state, infinite mindset, permanence, or control culture, today, now, rules, compliance, those kinds of things. We'll just need a few more of you to kind of weigh in, and then we will end the poll and share the results.
Hey, Glenn, this is Wendy. Real quick. There was just a couple of comments that the last poll, the participants were not able to see the results. So maybe this time we'll just confirm that they can see them.
Yeah, I shared it from my end, and I'm not sure why they couldn't. So I just ended the poll there, and we'll see if it gives me an option to share the results. I click share results. Can you see that, Wendy?
I can, but I'm also faculty. So can
Oh,
somebody
okay.
put in the chat? Are you able to see that?
You should see 50% on adaptive mindset, 36% on appreciative, 11% on infinite, and very little, 3% on control. So Hillary, I feel like this is kind of making the case that people want to reach for a more commitment culture and less of a control culture. How are you seeing that, Hillary?
That makes my heart happy. I'm going to validate that they can see the poll this time. But
They
I
can, and
think
unfortunately, thank you for letting me know that you cannot chat. That is my fault. So, hey, I think I just fixed that. I apologize.
Um, but I think, like, back to what Clint said, we as pretrial executives, we often want to escape, the pressure of that control mindset and culture. We know the right thing for our teams. So we need to be equipped with those tools as a leader. And that's why learning about culture is so important. So we can navigate that and really achieve that goal of having an appreciative and adaptive culture.
So for context, Hillary, the previous poll showed about 60% leaning towards control and about 40 was really like 58% leaning towards control, 42% leaning towards commitment. So that was that we're in tension. We're almost 50-50 leaning more towards control. This is telling me that if we were to use mindset as a lever for change, we have options. We have adaptive mindset, flexible and agile. We have appreciative mindset, focus on the future, and we have infinite mindset, perpetuating change. We have other options.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me that when we work with our clients, we know that mindset is everything for that lasting change. and those values and beliefs. We preach that every day, but sometimes we forget that when we engage with the people that we work with our colleagues, our stakeholders, our team, and how we show up.
So we're people too, right, Hillary? I mean, at the end of the day, we're all people-based things, and so like we can't look at, defendants and clients as being any different from us in the people realm because we're all people with mindset issues. You
Yeah,
know.
my judge will say people-centered public safety isn't just about the people we serve, it's about the people that we interact with and that we show up to work with every day.
All right, so mindset's one thing. We also got to change on the environment around us, the soil, so to speak. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those aspects. We're going to talk fairly candidly about some things, but also not in a lot of depth. These are really complex subjects that require a lot of work. So we're just going to give you a little bit of a lot of things and see where you're at on your environmental aspect. So in a few minutes, we're going to do a poll asking you about what parts of your environment do you see that need change as well. So one of the things we want to be thinking about in environmental culture is how we're influenced. And generally speaking, as human beings, we're influenced by essentially one or all of three groups: the close, the many, and the powerful. The close, the people that we're in close physical proximity to. Our cubicles, our team, our floor, our building, our unit, our office, like the people that are physically close to us, like those really powerful influencers on the way we think and the way that we operate. Also, there's the many, the way most people think in the organization, the way we perceive that we're supposed to think. And then there's the powerful, the way the boss thinks, the way the leaders think, the way the veterans think, the way the union thinks, the way that the sheriff thinks, or the way that the command officer thinks, and things like that. So we're really susceptible to modeling the mindset of the people that are close to us, the people who are outnumbered by, and the people that are in power positions. So from that perspective, we want to be thinking about four basic domains: psychological safety, organizational trauma, collective well-being, and leadership climate control. So we'll talk about those, just a little bit of each of those, and ask you which of these four things matters most to you in our next poll. So be thinking about that. So Hillary mentioned groupthink and pseudo-silence. And so you may have not heard of the word pseudo-silence, but I guarantee that you've experienced it. Groupthink is a pretty well-known phenomenon since the 80s when we all think alike. And it's most common in really cohesive groups with strong leadership influence. It's basically when we see a certain situation and we just think like each other and we don't have any diversity of opinion. Um, the problem with that is that can really it can suppress dissent. So it can be thinking of the new person who's to the organization saying, I don't see it that way, but I don't want to say anything about that because I'm supposed to think like you all think. And so we want dissent. We want people to push back. We want diversity of opinion because unity of opinion usually means we don't need multiple people. We just need one person. It can so give us this illusion that we're unanimous on something. You can imagine a group of five or six people. There's a strong leader, and everybody thinks like the leader. And so everybody says, "What do you think about this?" And everybody's like, "Yeah, sounds good to me. We all think alike." And then we realize that that's a bad decision later on down the line. So the problem with groupthink, it can really give us blind spots, like moral blind spots. It can suppress us from thinking of other alternatives that are more creative and more innovative. Groupthink is a really close cousin to pseudoscience. And again, you may not have heard this word, but you've experienced it when you're in a meeting and there's things that need to be said that aren't said. But they're said at the water cooler, they're said in the side chats, they're said in the meeting after the meeting, they're said in the meeting before the meeting, they're said on the text messages, they're said everywhere else but at the decision-making table. And when people are silent at the table, but inside their inner truth is not so silent. In other words, they have something to say, they just don't feel safe enough to be able to say it. And anytime that we have groupthink or pseudo-silence, it can tell us that there's psychological safety issues present. So really, the problem with pseudoscience is the organization can misinterpret that as consensus. It would look like this: Hey, everybody, we're making this decision. We're going this direction. What do y'all think? Everybody shuts up. Everybody just nods their head. They're implying yes, boss. And then, okay, we're all good with it. We're all in agreement. This is the way we're going to go. And then people complain about it at the water cooler afterwards. That's pseudo-silence. You've experienced that. And we've all experienced that. And that basically tells us we don't have psychological safety to say, hey, can we think of a different way of going about doing that? So pseudoscience can really be dangerous because it can look like us nodding in agreement when we don't really agree. It's when we put a smile on our face when we're not really feeling smiley on our side. It can stop us from reporting mistakes or misconduct. If people are scared to report the little things going wrong, like little mistakes and little failures, they're sure as heck not going to report the big things. And as leaders, we want to know the big things that are going wrong. And in order to know the big things that are going wrong, we have to make it psychologically safe for them to say, hey, I screwed up on this little thing, or I messed up on this little thing, or whatever. So it can really cause people to not report mistakes and not report setbacks and failures. And we want to know some of those things. So it really can kind of be this disconnection between our inner psychological truth and what we're willing to say at the decision-making table. Hillary, any thoughts on pseudoscience?
I think pseudo-silence, especially with pre-trials, it can show up where we appear to be aligned with stakeholders, but internally we as leaders have concerns, that maybe that isn't in line with best practices or isn't good for the presumption of innocence or due process in the long term, or even for public safety. And to me, there's a gap between what's being said and again, what those beliefs are. And that is a dangerous place for me as a leader to be. Or it's sometimes that one voice silences the voice of others. Disagreement and having differing point of views isn't always a bad thing, but sometimes in those stakeholder meetings, it can be hard to let everybody have that voice because, when no one pushes back, we interpret that as agreement, but oftentimes that's like a fear of speaking up or disrupting that relationship because we know we have to have that buy-in to have successful pretrial. And oftentimes that can erode us deploying true evidence-based pretrial supervision in our community if we don't speak up and advocate for best practices.
Yeah, like the old coal miners used to send a canary in the cave, and the old coal miners would say, let's send a canary in the cave to see if there's any dangerous gases. And if the canary doesn't come back, we're not going to go in there. Sometimes we need a canary in the cave to say, hey, we've been thinking this way our whole career. If we go down this road, that new person might be able to say, hey, that's a dangerous road, and here's why. And we need that voice. We need that voice to tell us something different and to like challenge our assumptions, challenge our beliefs, challenge our understanding of things because we're not always right. And sometimes our lived experience makes us think we're always right. Is that fair to say that, Hillary?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can go the reverse way as well. I want my stakeholders to feel comfortable with coming to me if they think I'm going down the wrong path, that I'm leading that agency. I need people to speak up and to disagree with me. And just like our other actors in our systems, they need us to speak up and to show them what best practices are, even if that might not be what they think is true. Pre-trial, we live in the world of assumptions. You think of our jail population, who we think in there, who is in there and who actually is, are often two different things. It's the same thing when we come together as a team. What we think and what is actually happening in practices, there's often a dissonance between those two.
Yeah, and Hillary, you've heard me share this story below before of like post-it notes was invented as a mistake. The reason we use post-it notes is somebody made a mistake. And somebody had the courage to speak up and say, "Hey, I know we were originally designed to make this glue. The glue didn't work because the glue just isn't sticky enough and it's not really good glue. We're just going to abandon this project." And somebody said, "Hey, let's sell the paper with the glue on it because people really love that." That person was an outlier, and that person basically had the idea to say, "Let's not sell the glue. Let's sell the paper with the glue on it." And post-it notes were invented, and now we all need post-it notes to do our job, and we can't live without them. It took somebody with the courage to say, we can stand up and do something a little bit different. And that's us living with yesterday's mistakes, essentially. And pseudoscience, you know, control cultures create pseudoscience, and pseudoscience creates control cultures. It's a kind of a chicken and egg situation. So if we want to change control cultures, if we want to get to commitment culture, we have to listen to people's voices. And to listen to people's voices, we got to work on psychological safety. So the way I look at psychological safety very broadly is this tension between our autonomous selves and our belonging selves. Autonomy is like, let me be me, let me be my own self, be authentically me, learn the way I need to learn, grow the way I need to grow, say what I need. Just let me be me and don't micromanage me. Just let me do things my way and let me learn things my way. But then there's this belonging side, which is like conform to the organization, feel like we matter, feel like we contribute, feel like we're aligned, feel like we're not just a robot. And sometimes when we get too much belonging, we give up autonomy because we're following the rules and the policies and procedures and doing things other people's way. We're cooperating with them, but then we're losing our individual autonomy. But if we have too much autonomy, we don't have consistency in the organization, and everybody's doing things their own way and everything's doing different. So it's about living in this tension between our autonomous selves, our needs to be ourselves in our way, and our needs for belonging. Because we're mammals, we're herd animals, we like to belong to the herd, basically. So broadly, psychological safety is living in this tension, maybe between a 3 and an 8 on autonomy versus belonging, sometimes giving up one in order to get another. We also talk about it in 6 areas at ACGI. We won't go into these areas in detail, but authentic self-expression is just like being my unapologetic self. It's just being me unapologetically, my quirks, my sense of humor, being me, 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 me. Authentic growth is learning the way that I need to grow, learning the way I need to learn, growing the way I need to learn. It's autonomy. Connected inclusion is like include my voice. Contribution basically means my voice actually matters, and I feel like I'm part of the organization, I'm part of the mission. Authentic voice means say what needs to be said, even if it's no, even if it's that's a dumb idea, even if it's here's an alternate way of doing things. It's like being our true, authentic inner voice saying, this is what I really think needs to be said, addressing the elephant in the room. And then co-elevation is essentially being able to challenge other people and support people, much like Hillary was just modeling, saying, hey, I might be wrong, challenge me by supporting me, support me by challenging me, living in both places of supporting and challenging people to get to a place of co-elevation, making each other smarter, making each other better. You can break these 6 areas down into specific behaviors. We won't get into all that today. But the point is, you can work on psychological safety by working on any of these 6 areas. So that's another talk for another day. So bottom line with psychological safety is it really matters. Project Aristotle was a project out of Google, the company Google, where they looked at their own employees and they looked at all these differences of high performing teams. And 2 things came out of this research. Number one, the most high performing teams had a sense of belonging. They felt like they belonged to something good, and they all had equal turn taking. Equal turn taking means they all got a chance to speak their voice. So when people have a sense of belonging to an organization, they feel attached to the mission, attached to the purpose, not the process, but attachment to the purpose. And they can be their autonomous selves by saying, I have a voice, I have something to say about it because I matter. Psychological safety is increased. And basically means that is all the difference of a high performing team versus a low performing team. There was some research also recently that just came out a couple months ago, and it looked at essentially 10 organizational outcomes with the query of which one of these 10 things does psychological safety matter for? And it actually came out to be important for all 10 things, 5 things to some degree and 5 things to a different degree. So you can look at the things in the green about what mattered the strongest, and the things in yellow still matter. They were statistically significantly impacted, just at a more moderate level. So the point is psychological safety matters to organizational performance. Some things more than others. In this case, the green things and not so much the yellow things. So there's very strong research about psychological safety and the degree to which it helps us perform better and our organizations perform better is kind of the bottom line there. But it's more than just the absence of a threat. It's that presence of a connection, like feeling like you really are seen, you really do matter. It's about truly being your authentic, true self and saying what needs to be said. And then there's organizational safety and trauma. We're going to talk about this very generally. This might activate you if you've experienced any of this. And so just be mindful of yourself. If you need to take a break as we talk about some of this stuff, be mindful of kind of your own needs for recovery if this emotionally activates you. So in the space of organizational safety, or what's sometimes called psychosocial safety as opposed to psychological safety, there's 2 types of stress that we experience in this job. There's this kind of stress that we sign up for, which is known as occupational stress. And that is essentially different than organizational stress, which is the kind of stress we often don't sign up for. Occupational stress is the stuff we sign up for. I know I'm dealing with dangerous tasks, we're with dangerous situations, sometimes dangerous people. Trauma is contagious with the people that we serve. There's these dangerous situations, these dangerous decisions. That's the stuff we sign up for in the justice system. Like we know that we're getting into working in risky situations. Anytime we're talking about crime and crime control and recidivism and public safety, we're okay working in these situations, and it stresses us out. The stuff that we often don't sign up for is the stress that comes from the organization itself. Change clutter, change fatigue, conflict among peers, leadership conflict, low quality teamwork, harassment, discrimination, all the isms, negative media, social isolation, return to office, going, working at home suddenly and like all the things that happen that we didn't necessarily sign up for, those are the organizational stressors. And when you put those two things together, the stress we sign up for and the stress we don't sign up for, the occupational stress and the organizational stress, we then worry about organizational trauma. And so organizational trauma is essentially patterns of things that happen over time that injure us or make us ill. So if you can imagine a horizontal and a vertical axis, one of those vertical axis is occupational tension on a scale of low to high, and organizational tension, low to high. Oftentimes, if you look in the upper right-hand quadrant, that's dangerous work, dangerous occupational stress, but in chronically chaotic or threatened environment. It's when we're in both high organizational stress and high occupational stress that we're at risk of organizational trauma. And when we live in that in sustained levels, when it happens over and over and over and over again, it doesn't have to be just one incident, it could be a series of incidents over time. We worry about that injuring and making some people ill. If you could imagine safe work in a comfortable context in the two green zones, that's pretty easy work in a pretty easy environment, right? So we really want to be thinking of that combination of the stress from the job and the stress from the organizations themselves. And it could be a single event. It could be that one bad thing that happened. It can be ongoing wounding events over a period of time. It could be the fact that we're sometimes empathic people and we take on the traumas of other people and we take on the traumas that we work around, including a fellow staff. People, when they're exposed to harassment, discrimination, and change fatigue and change clutter, and that's contagious with us at the water cooler. We kind of get drained because other people are drained, those kinds of things. Anything that accumulates over a long-standing amount of time in the justice system can really negatively impair our culture because it injures us as human beings. So it would look like if there were signs and symptoms where there's a lot of discouragement around the water cooler, like everybody's discouraged. There's a constant state of high alert or hypervigilance when people are always worried about the worst case thing happening. There's positions you can't keep full, cyclical burnout of staff and leaders. Conversations are full of anxiety. There's ongoing instability in people's personal lives outside of like the work-life balance conversation. There's ongoing instability. People are continuing to be triggered. There's kind of pervasive lack of trust. There's like worldview problems where the world's falling apart. Nothing works. Everything is an illusion. Everything's going to go wrong. Everything's, catastrophic kind of thinking. Those kind of things can give us indications that we might have organizational trauma. And even culture work can be hard in situations when organizational trauma is present. People's health can erode. They can get into addictive behaviors because of the work. I can give you kind of personal experiences with this myself. But in pretrial, I think we're at risk of this, Hillary.
I think we've all experienced, the organizational trauma or just the different things, the collateral things that kind of get splashed on us as we navigate pretrial services, whether it's the constant dodging of the different narratives going on in the media landscape today. We all know about, those kind of things that even happened right before the conference last year, or maybe something did happen in your community. For us in Indiana, there was a narrative about pretrial last year when funding was cut for the majority of pretrial agencies, and now we're navigating, preventative detention, which isn't always bad. But navigating and aligning your stakeholders as you're steering that ship, sometimes that can create that organizational trauma that we didn't sign up for, because living in that constant state of tension does take a toll on you. And that strain can sometimes then unintentionally, we can translate that to our staff and how we show up and interact with them every day as well.
So we'll talk about its opposite, which is collective well-being. Sometimes to work ourselves out of trauma, we have to work towards something better. And so oftentimes culture change, in my opinion, is not so much fixing what's wrong, but building the thing that you want to do to compete with it. And so building the thing you want to do to compete with it, sometimes we can look at the opportunity for collective well-being, which is well beyond this kind of narrative of self-care. This is a whole different talk in and of itself. But collective well-being is basically saying there's a difference between morale work and well-being work. Morale work is how we might feel today. Well-being work is like how we feel most of the time or all of the time. Morale is might like be, you have a pizza party day, for example, to make people feel good, or a once a year employee appreciation event. That really helps people's morale, doesn't help people's well-being. Well-being is what we do all the time to take care of people's life adjustment issues and kind of their kind of larger self, if you will. So well-being is more cultural. Morale is a little bit more temporary and surface, if you will. So if you want to look at well-being, like what it means overall, you can break it down into 8 dynamics or 8 areas. We often think of well-being primarily in areas 1 and 3, our emotional well-being, like our mental health, and our somatic or physiological well-being, which is like our physical health. When we think of self-care, well-being, wellness, self-care, any of that stuff, that's usually what we go to. We don't often think of our number 2, intellectual well-being, learning and growing. Number 4, our social well-being, our relationships, our commitment, and our attachments to other people. 5, our occupational well-being, like upward growth, pay and benefits, and all those kinds of things. Our environmental well-being, access to sunlight, great office space, clean water, some of those things. Spiritual and cultural well-being, being ourselves for who we are and how we show up. And then safety, everything we just talked about with psychological safety, psychosocial safety, physical safety, being able to kind of speak our voice and those kind of things. So the idea with organizational well-being is that it's at 4 levels. Individual, as you can see in the green bubble to the left or to the right. Team, which is obviously small groups of individuals, large groups, and then the organization overall. So thinking of all 8 areas of well-being in your culture at both individual levels, at team levels, at larger group levels, and the organization overall, and working towards well-being across all 8 of these dimensions, rather than just focusing on a pizza party once a month and an employee awards once a year. Hillary, any thoughts on well-being from a pretrial perspective?
I think well-being from a pretrial perspective is that we can often get very tired. And, we say that we play it safe and we can kind of get in those root practices, but safe, that isn't always a good place where we make the best decisions. And, in pretrial, every decision that we make is a public safety decision. So for me, supporting staff well-being is actually a public safety strategy. And when I frame it that way for my stakeholders, it becomes something that we really prioritize. Um, and it's something that we really have to, work together at an individual level to practice every day so that we can support the health of the group as a whole.
So basically, we can work against trauma or we can work for well-being. We can work towards psychological safety. We can also work towards kind of getting beyond the morale work and getting to really like cultural well-being, which is like the habits that we form for the organization to take care of the people and the people to take care of the organization, the people to take care of themselves and the people to take care of each other. Self-care is like go get yourself stressed out and then go do some self-care on your own, right? That's the implicit message of self-care. Collective care is like you get it's a stressful job and you get the healing right here at work too because we can all take care of each other in these stressful organizational or occupational circumstances. So it's really a difference in mindset, but it's mostly a difference in the environment itself. Or we could choose leadership climate control. Another option for cultural change is change the way that we show up as leaders. And what this basically comes down to is acknowledging this close, many, powerful thing that we as leaders have an outsized influence on culture. We're outnumbered because of the many. We don't always get to be close to people because we're not everywhere at all times, but we have, because of the power dynamic and like the amount of respect that's for us as formal leaders and informal leaders, we have this outsized influence on culture. And leadership climate control is based on this research that about 95% of us feel that we're self aware, but only 15% of us are. We have a lot of gaps between how we show up with our intentions and our actual impact on people. There's a big gap there between our intentions as a leader and how we actually show up. And so closing that gap is being self aware, having emotional intelligence, and having a sense of what we call resilient optimism, which is like having thick skin and still holding on to the bigger goal that we're trying to achieve and not being a victim of the setbacks, but really holding on to the kind of optimistic view of things, but having resilience enough to be able to get through the tough stories that get us to the ideal place to be. Bottom line with leadership climate control is just this nice combination of being self aware, asking for feedback who we are, raising our emotional intelligence as leaders, being vulnerable, being humble, showing that we're not all things to all people, and then having a sense of resilient optimism and saying, we're more committed to the goal than we are to our individual comfort zones. We're going to abandon our comfort zones to get to this higher place of higher purpose. And if the leader has that mindset, it's contagious so that other people believe that. So again, it's this message that as a leader, you are culture. You can stand up to culture all you want, and you got to be culture yourself. That's really what it comes down to. So we're going to ask you for your opinions on this next poll. If you were to change something in your environment, what would that look like? We're basically going to ask you to weigh in on whether you think psychological safety is the most highest impact on your culture, whether it's organizational trauma that is the most impactful for your current culture, whether it's collective well-being that's the most impactful on your culture, or whether it's the way leaders show up is the most impactful on your culture. We're curious to know what impacts you the most. This might challenge some of our assumptions going into this webinar. So we'll see what you all think about this. Got about 40% participating. Basically just asking you to identify, what's the thing that really matters to you the most? Of all the environmental aspects of the culture you would like to build, what seems to matter to you the most? Well, let's go for just a couple more seconds. And so far, it's looking fairly even across the board, Hillary. It's looking to be fairly evenly distributed. We'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results in just a second. So as you can see, we'll share this in a second here. I'm not sure, Wendy, if you can make this shareable on your end. There it goes. You can see where we land. Some of us would like to work on psychological safety, some in other areas. Just show to me, I don't know what you think about this, Hillary, but to me it shows we have options. We don't have any one thing that inhibits our control culture. We have a lot of options that inhibits our control culture. And so to me, this says we have other options. I don't know how you're seeing it, Hillary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we have a lot of options on how we can impact our culture, and sometimes it just they're not seeing the results again. So I'll read them to you. But psychological safety was at 17%. Organizational trauma was at 24%. Collective well-being came in at 29%. And leadership and climate control came in at 30%. So what we're kind of seeing for that is there's a lot of different factors and ways that we can show up to impact our culture, which to me shows us that we have a lot of opportunities where we can, intervene and improve.
So by virtue of this webinar, we gave the illusion that there's two types of culture, commitment and control. And really commitment is a broad interpretation of many different types of change cultures that live. And so I think what the polls today, Hillary, have taught me is that we got stuff to work on. We don't have to always commit to a control culture. We can also commit to other types of cultures. Now, some of you may be thinking, but we still need control in our culture. We still need rules. We still need bounds. We still need processes. And you are 100% right. I think of it like golf clubs in a golf bag. Like nobody takes one or two golf clubs to a golf game. You take like 12 or 13 or 15 or something. You got to have options. And so as a leader, as organizations, we have to have more options than just the rules and the processes and the boundaries. We have to have more options than us. And so we have other options. We have 8 other options to work on with culture. We can keep our rules, we can keep our processes, we can keep our concrete stuff, but we don't have to be victim to all those things all the time and put everything in that bucket. We can explore and grow adaptive mindset, appreciative mindset, infinite mindset, psychological safety. We can address organizational trauma. We can address organizational well-being and 8 elements within organizational well-being. And we can ask leaders to show up differently. So we have lots of options to change culture, and culture change is tough. Culture king is really, really important. I think it's been pretty well established in the change literature that organizations in our system aren't very good at changing. We have about a 70 to 90% failure rate for implementation of evidence-based interventions, evidence-based programs, new policies, new practices. Generally speaking, our organizations fail more often than not at implementing change. The global literature suggests 70%. The original source for that is unknown. If you look deeper into the organizational science and the implementation science literature, you see failure rates as high as 85 to 95% when we're training and praying only, when we're just passing out rules, when we're just passing laws and funding mandates, or when we're just disseminating information. Those typical methods of organizational change fail 9 times out of 10. Evidence-based practices, about 14% make it into daily practice. 14%. We put a lot of work into risk, needs, responsivity, and evidence-based practice, and only 14% really make it into the cultures of the organizations. And if you look at change data from people-dependent innovations, essentially what we do, we're a people-based business that's run by people for people. We fail 80 to 90% of the time per the implementation science literature. So the point is, culture wins. Culture is king. And if we have a control culture that is anti-change, sometimes, I mean, if you believe that our like recidivism rates, if you will, in the justice system are in 50 to 60%, that's a better rate than our organizational change literature. I mean, the organizations aren't any better changing than the clients that go through the justice system. In fact, the organizations are worse. So maybe culture, our 80% 90 failure rate is upstream from the failure rate of the clients that we serve and our retention rates and things like that. Hillary, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about implementation, it fails a lot of time because our culture isn't aligned, and it isn't always that our infrastructure or our policy or our assessments aren't good. It's that they're only as good as the values and beliefs that carry them, and how unified we are when we come together, and how well we show up every day at work. And that's what culture and about wellness is so important.
So, can culture change? And the answer is yes. If you look at good versus bad culture, for example, commitment versus control culture, all the stuff that we talked about, I think we've made the case that culture can change. And so, the thing is, like, we're not very well educated on how to change culture. That's not something that in our field there's been a lot of training on and things like that. And so, we have a model at ACGI that we help people with that's basically based on a PDSA cycle, Plan, Do, Study, Act. It's a construct and implementation science. But we basically put people through 10 weeks of learning on how to change culture and give them concrete tools and strategies on how to do it. Hillary's been through that Culture Academy before, where we take 10 weeks and we go through a whole process of giving people education and tools on some of the areas that you just heard about. We give people different organizational tools and an assessment tool and change tools and dialogue tools and all this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in ever learning about the culture work, you can scan the QR code there, and it'll take you to a website that gives you a little bit more information about how to change culture and some learning that's accessible to you. Kind of bottom line, Hillary, if you want to take us home with some bottom lines here from the pretrial perspective, and then we'll ask for some feedback on our webinar today.
And kind of like what I said, culture shapes our outcomes more powerful than our policy. So our policy is kind of like our framework. It's the road that we're driving on, but how far we go really is our culture, and that's the gas in our tank. And that mindset to me that's the catalyst and the most important thing for any culture change. And especially in pretrial, just because of the dynamics of our work that's unique in the criminal justice system, psychological safety is so important, and how we show up every day is going to influence our culture. And pretrial systems, they thrive the most when we as leaders work to intentionally shape that culture. And as shown on the next slide, culture isn't just abstract. It's how we show up every day. I know some people in the chat were talking about what are practical ways that we do that, and how we show up. And what I would say is you don't have to change the system in one day. You can just keep influencing the moments that you're in. And that's not just for you as leaders, that's for your staff as well, because everybody plays a part in the culture and has ownership in the culture. It's not just my responsibility as a leader or my stakeholders' responsibility. It's the responsibility of the whole organization. And that's kind of how we go from survival mode to having a sustainable pretrial agency. And when we talk about that, that's how we go from bad to good, and from good to great. And that's what compliance versus that commitment culture is. And I think we have a lot of good agencies, but if we want to be great, if we want to move forward, if we want to really implement all those essential elements, we need a culture that's going to sustain us through the pendulums of our system. And with that, I think Glenn and I would kind of just call you to think about what mindset shift that you will practice, and what behavioral you'll have to model, and what cultural risks that will address, as you think about the things that you learned today.
And we would love if you would scan the QR code and give us your feedback on the webinar itself today. We very intentionally stayed very broad and abstract for you, knowing that there's lots of concrete areas we can dive deeper into. If you ever decide to go into the Culture Academy, you learn about 3 different concrete tools for each one of those 8 areas. There's structured organizational tools that we teach people how to use, and you're able to use those and all that kind of stuff. But more than anything, we just want to know if this webinar was important to you, if it was relevant, and to give us a little bit of feedback about what you thought about today. Wendy, anything you want to add to the conversation?
No other than to wrap up. So I don't, and to say thank you. So any further comments before I do that?
I will say in the chat that some people are asking that this would be a good multi-day training. And if you were on earlier, Glenn will be at the conference this year. We'll have a all-day leadership training the day before the conference starts. If you really want to dig in more, because you're right, this type of training does deserve a deeper dive. And then we'll be with you the whole conference if you want to talk more about it.
And feel free to email me, and my email and my contact information is on the screen. You can go to that QR code. You can email Hillary and just let us know. And we hope to see you at the conference if you're here today. And hope this was important for you. Hope it got your mind going in a good place about culture and gave you some language to talk about culture. Wendy, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, first off, thank you so much, Glenn and Hillary, for just doing an outstanding job. It's very clear your hearts are in this work, both pre-trial as well as developing leaders and developing folks' culture. So grateful for that. Grateful for you being here with us. And yes, Hillary and Glenn took the words right out of my mouth. I couldn't have said it better. We will have a special leadership day on Sunday before our conference that Glenn and Hillary will lead, and a time to dive deeper. And in addition to that, there will be some sessions also at the conference, both by Glenn and Hillary, as well as others focused on leadership. So that's something that's really important to us. We've heard from the field that that's something that's needed. And so we're wanting to bring that resource to you. Our conference registration should be opening by the middle of April. So here in the next couple of weeks. So I threw our website in the chat. Be on the lookout at our website to find out more information. And otherwise, thank you all for joining. Thank you for letting us run just a couple minutes over and for sticking with us here. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. Keep in touch.
Thank you.